Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Nikos Tsafos, and I'm a senior fellow with the Energy Security and Climate Change program here at CSIS. And I want to welcome you to our virtual event on innovation in transportation fuels. This is our fifth event in our Energy Innovation series. We've already had events on storage and battery technologies, on grid modernization, carbon management, advanced nuclear energy. And we have a sixth event coming up that will wrap everything together. Our goal in this series is to highlight the important role of innovation in our energy system. Our motivation for this series, we think, is straightforward enough. Energy and innovation go hand in hand. It's very hard to think of our energy system without thinking of innovation. And our prosperity depends on it. Our ability to compete depends on it. Our ability to meet some of the greatest challenges of the 21st century depends on the innovation in our energy system. And so we think that this is a topic that needs to get a lot more attention. Innovation, of course, is not just what gets discovered in the lab. Innovation is about taking ideas out of the lab and demonstrating them, proving them, and then deploying them at scale. So when we talk about innovation, we're thinking not just about what our scientists are doing in the lab, but also how our private sector and the government can help pull those innovations out of the lab and into the marketplace. So we're very excited for this morning's conversation, and we're very thankful that you're joining us. What we're going to do is we're going to start with a brief keynote from Daniel Simmons, who is the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy. He's going to give some opening remarks about his perspective on this topic. And after he's done, I'm going to introduce our three-person panel, and we're going to spend about an hour or so talking with them about this topic. So without any further ado, Assistant Secretary Simmons, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It is great to be here today virtually to talk about, I think, what is a really important topic. And I just wanted to emphasize what we just said, as in the Department of Energy, particularly my office, the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, agrees wholeheartedly that innovation in energy is key, and that it is not enough to be funding innovation on the laboratory scale, that those things need to make it into the real world. And honestly, the Department of Energy, we are not doing our job unless we are seeing some of the technologies that we work on make it into the real world. So just really wanted to emphasize that just right off the bat. So I lead the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, where we are committed to advancing affordable, reliable, clean energy and offering consumers more energy choices. This is key overall. And this is a part of the Department of Energy. My office is a part of the Department of Energy's broad energy approach. Specifically, what my office works on is in energy efficiency, renewable power, and transportation. And one of the interesting things as we are thinking about the future of energy is that these sectors are becoming much more tightly coupled than they have ever been before. And that will be an interesting transformation. As I was looking over my notes, these notes earlier today, I was just thinking that, if we go back 100, we have not had this wide open future of energy particularly in transportation, for at least 100 years, more than 100 years. Where if you go back to the 1800s, early 1900s, thinking about energy for transportation, there was some electrification, there was some crazy steam ideas, seems kind of nuts for small scale, but people tried these things. There was alcohol and there was gasoline, all competing together. And in some ways we're back to that, except for we have more, because now, like, not only you throw in that, but you throw in hydrogen, you throw in e-fuels. There's a lot of exciting things going on in the transportation sector. And as we all know, as we look to the future, one of the things that has a lot of promise and just a lot of buzz right now is obviously electrification. all of the automakers are producing electric vehicles, or they will soon be releasing them. And over the past 10 years, our battery work, the Department of Energy's battery work has helped reduce the cost of lithium-ion battery packs by more than 80%. That is fantastic. One of the things that we have worked on and we will continue to work on is reducing the amount of cobalt in these batteries, because if you look at the scale that these batteries will be produced at, that cobalt really becomes a limiting factor, and also something that increases the cost. And we are continuing to work to drive down the cost with a goal of lowering battery pack costs to below $100 per kilowatt hour, while decreasing charge time to less than 15 minutes, and then at the same time providing a 300-mile range. And one thing to note about the DOE's goals is that we measure that $100 per kilowatt hour pack cost a little bit differently than some others, than say like Bloomberg NEF. This is usable power versus rated power. Our goals actually seem if you're comparing, it's sometimes an apples to oranges comparison, but our goals are actually rather aggressive. And we recognize that internal combustion engine is going to be with us for decades to come, especially in medium duty, heavy duty. But not only that, if you just look at the current car park, there are, these vehicles are going to last for, vehicles produced today will last for decades. One of the things that we have heard from automakers and others is, this desire to have a domestic, affordable, low carbon drop-in liquid fuels, and that would be important for decades. So that's one of the things we're working on. Not only that, but in terms of transportation fuels for light duty vehicles, but also for the aviation industry. And more recently, I testified on Capitol Hill. It might have been last week. Time all runs together in this time of COVID, but and got a number of questions on marine fuels and opportunities for biofuels in the area of marine, because biofuels are by definition low sulfur. By their mere creation, they are low sulfur fuels. So that is an opportunity as well as we look to the future for biofuels to be targeting heavier fuel markets. So one office, as a part of the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, is our Bioenergy Technology Office. And this is the bioenergy options is really what they are. It's the one thing that the office does. Over the summer, we announced $97 million in funding for high impact technology research and development to accelerate the bioeconomy. This includes biofuels, but also bioproducts. One of the reasons for that is that biofuels can become more cost effective if we look at them as the petroleum industry does with a barrel of oil. It's not just that we're producing fuel; it's also the important products that come out of a barrel of oil, or that comes out of a ton of biomass. So we have a number of projects to help drive biofuels forward, particularly as we've been thinking in recent times at some heavier fuels with aviation fuels, possibly marine fuels, that there could be a lot of opportunities there. Also, as I mentioned earlier, hydrogen. There is an incredible amount of buzz and excitement around the world in terms of hydrogen, and hydrogen and fuel cell technology is an important part of our transportation R&D mix. One important aspect of that is something that we call H2 at scale, is looking for all of the opportunities for hydrogen, as in hydrogen gets sometimes hyped as especially in the past, it was kind of hyped sometimes as just a transportation fuel. But the reality is that for hydrogen to become a cost-effective reality for transportation, we need to look at all of the uses that it could be used for, especially as you're thinking about green hydrogen and the production of hydrogen from, different than it is today with steam methane reforming. So earlier this year, the Department of Energy announced 18 new projects totaling $64 million in support of our H2 scale vision for affordable hydrogen production, storage, distribution, and use. And these projects will help bring us closer to realizing hydrogen's potential as a resilient, affordable energy solution and a green energy solution. Though, we definitely have a lot of work to do in that area. Also, next Thursday is October 8th, which is National Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Day. 1008, which is essentially the atomic weight of hydrogen. It has to be the nerdiest day ever in terms of how it got its name. But October 8th is National Hydrogen Fuel Cell Day. So be on the lookout for some new announcements on that day. So we at the Department of Energy are very excited about the future of transportation. As I mentioned earlier, the future in many ways is wide open. And we're not going to have a single solution, the one solution, I don't think, for decades to come, just as was happening in the late 1800s. The difference, though, is today all of these things are at scale. They are at massive scale. And the Department of Energy is going to continue to fund a bunch of different technologies to drive us, to drive a bunch of these technologies forward to see what technologies will win in the end. So we are looking forward, obviously, to working with many of you to drive forward this innovation that we think is necessary. And just to emphasize where we began, that innovation is key. We need a lot of innovation in terms of transportation, in terms of transportation energy and transportation fuels, battery with electrification, but also on the fuel side. I am confident that we are well on our way to achieving our transportation vision. So thank you very much for your time today. I'm excited to hear from the panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Simmons. I think the way you laid it out, and I think in particular the idea that there's no one solution, that we're really talking about several distinct markets, from light duty to heavier to heavy to marine to aviation. You also, I think, teed up our panel wonderfully, and I especially appreciate the Hydrogen Day. That is something I did not know, and now I will know. So I'll be on the lookout for the memes next week, see how people are celebrating Hydrogen Day. So thank you very much. We're going to let you go now, but thank you very much for joining us. So now let me switch over to our panel conversation. Before I introduce our panelists, let me remind you that this is the portion that we're also going to be taking in your questions. So if you have one, you can go on our website at csis.org, where you sign up for this event. And there is a button there that says, submit a question. So if you do that, then my colleagues will get that question to me. So please go ahead and do that whenever you have a question. So now we're going to switch over to our panel conversation. I'm just very excited because as Assistant Secretary Simmons said, it's a very diverse and complicated landscape. So we've tried to pull together some experts that can speak to the different dimensions of this conversation. So joining me on this virtual panel are first John Farrell, who's a laboratory program manager for vehicle technologies at NREL. Number two, we have Bruno Miller, who is Managing Director of Fuels and Regulatory Affairs at Fulcrum Bioenergy. Number three, we have Matthew Blisk, who is in engineering and product development with Shell Hydrogen. And so we try to bring together sort of a diverse perspective, and I think it's going to be a very exciting conversation. So we're going to start off, we've asked John Farrell to sort of take that complexity that Assistant Secretary Simmons described in his keynote and dive a little bit more into it. Give us a sense of what is happening in the lab system, what the overarching landscape looks like. So we're going to turn to him for some opening remarks with a slide presentation, and then we're going to go to the rest of the speakers. So John, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Great. Thank you, Bruno. And I'd like to thank Assistant Secretary Simmons for teeing up this discussion. Are the slides visible? Great. So I want to just give a high-level view of the future of the fuels landscape, addressing some of the challenges that Assistant Secretary Simmons laid out. Next slide, please. And I'll start out with a a slide that describes at a high level what our transportation system today looks like. As Assistant Secretary Simmons mentioned, this is a pretty well established, very mature industry that's looked pretty much the same for the last 100 years or so. Predominant energy source is petroleum, which is going through the energy pathway of conversion and refinery, and it provides the liquid fuels that power the vast majority of our transportation fleet, at least at this time. Next slide, please. But there's abundant indications that things are changing, that there is the desire and the need for change. Just last week, Governor Newsom from California announced that California will phase out gasoline-powered cars. The phase out for trucks was also announced. So some very aggressive executive actions that are motivated by reductions in climate change pollutants as well as criteria pollutants. So this is a very recent example, but the next slide shows what happens if you go to Wikipedia and try to see at a larger level what is the phase out of fossil fuel vehicles really encompass. And you can see that there are now at least 14 countries and over 20 cities around the world that have proposed banning passenger vehicles, or in some cases banning internal combustion engines from city centers, really pushing the transportation system that we've known for the last 100 years into new territory. So the question is always, well, policy can provide a useful guiding beacon for where we need to go, but a lot of times, as we know, policy can get ahead of where the market is and where technology is. So we have to ask the question, if we really are going to be phasing out these historic ways of powering our transportation fleet, what will replace it? And CSIS, I know, has talked recently about electrification. If you go to the next slide, please. There's abundant ways that you can think about how the future transportation system looks like. This is a view that we have developed here that's similar to many, but it's focusing on, what would you have to do to get to a decarbonized transportation sector? And one thing to note here is that at the top of the figure, the real cornerstone of the decarbonized transportation sector is electrons. And these can be used in many ways. If you look on the sort of right-hand side, the electrons can be flowing directly through charging systems into vehicles to be used directly as an electrified vehicle. Or you can take them through an electrolysis stage, produce hydrogen that can then be used to power fuel cells. Or there are ways that you can use carbon sources such as CO2 capture. Plants are, of course, very efficient at that, or industrial processes as well. Those can be used to produce chemicals as well that look more like today's liquid fuels, and those can be used to then power vehicles. The key thing to note here is that this is a much more complex transportation system than we have today. And as Assistant Secretary Simmons mentioned, there is no single solution. We need to be applying our ingenuity and our innovation to all of these options to identify the most effective and cost-effective ways to make sure that passenger and freight mobility needs are met around the country and around the world. Next slide, please. So if we start thinking about what this looks like in practice, there's a way to differentiate the needs of vehicles and the sort of optimal fuels that could power them. And it's shown schematically here. This is a vehicle weight on the left and then daily miles traveled. And really for some applications, heavy-duty battery electrification makes a lot of sense. These are for light vehicles that don't travel very far. As you start getting to heavier vehicles that travel a little bit farther, hydrogen and fuel cells seem to be a niche fit that works really well. But there's still a large part of the transportation fleet, especially very heavy vehicles, that are still going to be relying on internal combustion engines. And the question is, what are the low carbon, high energy density fuels that are able to provide the power to move these vehicles around? Next slide. So that's really where the challenge is. What is it that will provide the power with the right sort of carbon footprint for these technologies? Battery electrification, fuel cells have come a long way in the past decade or two. They are at least fairly well established at this point. There's still opportunities for improvement, but a real gap exists now in terms of what are the low carbon liquid fuels that will provide very heavy vehicle transportation. Next slide. And for the past 2 decades, conventional biofuels have been the solution that has been focused on very heavily. There have been resource estimates that indicate that there are about 1 billion tons of biomass that can be domestically converted into biofuels and bioproducts. This could displace up to about 25% of the petroleum we use annually. So it is a useful and important solution. There's been a lot of innovation that has happened in the last 10 years or so that I don't have time to talk about. But even at full utilization, this will only be a partial solution to the liquid transportation needs that we have. So an important contributor, but only one of many. Next slide. So Assistant Secretary Simmons mentioned e-fuels. This is another option that could complement biofuels that would provide the liquid transportation fuels needed by advanced internal combustion engines. And e-fuels is the term that I will be using to describe what in the global arena goes by a number of different fuels. So there's e-diesel, there's power to fuel, there's power to X. They all basically have the same commonality of a electricity origin that provides fuels that you can use in engines that are resembling those that we use today. Next slide. So looking at this in a bit more detail, it really starts with some basic inputs. You need carbon, nitrogen, and hydrogen, and oxygen. But renewable electrons are really the key to making this effective, because otherwise, as we'll see, there are some significant penalties for producing these that don't make them advantageous compared to today's fuels. But basically, you start with the inputs. You can convert them to a number of intermediates. Some of these intermediates, such as methanol and ammonia, can be used directly as fuels, but oftentimes these are converted to a final stage of fuels that look a bit more like what today's engines are used to operating with. So it's the kind of chemical manipulation that engineers are very well familiar with. We've been doing these types of things for a very long time. The real key is to figuring out how to make a source of renewable electrons pair up with the various other options to produce the best fuel mix going forward. Next slide. And this is a schematic of one example of a recent project that we have been working on with SoCalGas that has allowed them to do basically what I just proposed at a small scale. So they have electricity from a utility scale solar farm that sometimes during the day and year is excess. They don't have any place to put it on the grid, so they will combine it with water and electrolyze it to produce hydrogen. Once they have hydrogen, they will feed it to a bioreactor that they inject carbon dioxide into, so waste carbon dioxide. It will be converted into methane that they then put into their standard methane pipeline. So this is a way for them to take solar electricity, which doesn't have a use, convert it to methane, which then they can use as part of a standard fuel mix. So this is something that SoCalGas has been doing at a small scale. The question is this scalable? Next slide. In general, if you look at e-fuels and ask the question, are they technically feasible at scale? It's worth noting that some of the technologies, the electrolysis example, CO2 to CO, Fischer-Tropsch, some of these are very mature technologies. They've been done industrially at scale for a long time. Assistant Secretary Simmons mentioned hydrogen at scale. That is a key part of making this whole piece work, because the very first block of all of this is hydrogen. You could produce it and stop there, use it for fuel cells, but it is a key for everything that follows as well. So that's where a lot of technology innovation is to make sure that we can make this work at the relevant scales. And I will note that there are some really new exciting bioelectrochemical pathways that are at a very early stage. These have some significant benefits compared to current industrial mature technologies, but there are a lot of challenges that must be overcome for commercial viability, and that's where a lot of the interesting research is going on. Next slide. So I'll end my discussion with really two key questions about e-fuels. One, I've mentioned that the motivation of pursuing this path is to have a low greenhouse gas fuel. So the question is, are these low greenhouse gas options? This is some data from a report done in Europe, looking at the life cycle carbon intensity, in this case of electro diesel. And what we have shown on this graph are the carbon CO2 equivalents per megajoule of fuel that come from a variety of different electricity mixes. So there's one with 50%, 56% renewable. There's a natural gas combined cycle, gas turbine, the EU mix, as well as a low carbon natural gas combined cycle gas turbine with carbon capture. And you can see that there is the opportunity, if you have 100% renewables, to get a very low carbon footprint for these fuels. If you could just advance the slide once. The baseline here, though, is that red line, which is the petroleum-derived gasoline and diesel baseline. And you can see that for many of these cases, if you don't have the right electricity mix, you actually have a carbon footprint that is higher than the petroleum-derived fuels. And what the indications are is that you need to get at least 70% renewables on the grid for the mix that you're using to create these e-fuels in order to do better than petroleum-derived diesel. So a very significant amount of renewables are required to actually get to the very low greenhouse gas levels that we're talking about. So that is a consideration that is a challenge for achieving this at scale. Next slide. The second question worth asking is how much electricity is required to achieve this? So this is again, a European study looking for Germany, what would be required to convert the entire German light duty and heavy duty fleet to electricity-based fuel. So shown there is the battery electric case. So this is the amount of energy required to electrify the entire fleet with battery electric vehicles. If you could advance the slide once. This is just a minimax case. If you could advance it again, we'll see the examples for hydrogen and fuel cells. You can see that if you wanted to convert every vehicle in Germany to hydrogen and fuel cells, you would need twice as much electricity as you would in the direct electrification case. If you could advance one more, there are a variety of e-fuel cases that show that you have, again, another doubling beyond the hydrogen case to get to the electricity power levels required to electrify with those types of fuels. If you advance once more to put this in scale, this red line here is the current annual electricity production for Germany. So to convert to battery electricity, you need to put 50% more electrical capacity into Germany than you currently have. You need to double it to get to hydrogen fuel cells and double it again to get to e-fuels. So the amount of energy required is massive. That's one thing that we need to keep in mind as we look at these options. Next slide. So to wrap things up, it's clear that we need abundant sources of low carbon fuels for IC engines if we're going to meet global decarbonization goals. Advanced biofuels can supply some of this need, but e-fuels are an attractive option that could be a longer term technology that provides the ability to address hard to electrify transportation needs. Needing to achieve at least 70% renewables on the grid mix is a steep barrier, but that's what is required to better the carbon footprint of conventional fuels. And the transition to e-fuels will require massive amounts of electricity, more than direct electrification. So ultimately, we need to make sure that we use our renewable electrons wisely. They are not as abundant as would be desired, and it is something that needs to be required, considered in a larger systems integration perspective. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, for this. You put a lot of things on the table, and I'm going to come back to you to talk about some of them. But before I do that, let me go to the rest of our panelists, and I'm going to first turn to Bruno Miller. Bruno, maybe if we can start off at the top, just tell us a little bit about Fulcrum Bioenergy, what you guys are trying to do, and what your progress has been so far.
Thank you, Nikos, and thank you for the invitation to be in this panel. It's a great conversation and very timely topics. Fulcrum Bioenergy, we are a municipal solid waste to fuels company. We started about 10 years ago. The foundational act of the company, if we can call it that, was to secure large amounts of municipal solid waste for our future projects. Municipal solid waste is very abundant. It's very low cost, and it's also close to urban centers where the demand for fuels is. So it turns out it's a very good feedstock to start a biofuels enterprise. When we first started, in addition to securing the feedstock, we thought about what technologies we could use for developing projects, bioenergy projects. And we decided to go with proven existing technologies and work on the integration of those proven existing technologies. That's part of the innovation cycle that we were discussing earlier, where you take the technology from the lab and then you need to take the jump to commercial scale. We wanted to de-risk that jump by basing our business model on existing technologies. So we take the municipal solid waste, we gasify it, that technology is known and available, and then we use Fischer-Tropsch reactors to turn the syngas from the gasifier into liquid fuels. As we just heard, Fischer-Tropsch has been around for many years, and it's also mature technology. What has not been done before was to put all those three steps together, and that's where Fulcrum came in, and we developed our own technology to do the integration. And so with this combination, we're able to produce very low carbon liquid transportation fuels.
Perfect, thank you. Lots of follow-up questions from you as well, but I will come back to you after we've done our first round. Let me now turn to our final panelist, Matthew Blisk. Matthew, just so you know, I'm already seeing questions that people are asking, hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. So you are
Yeah.
well timed. So let me just begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about how Shell thinks of hydrogen. What are you guys doing in this space? Kind of what is your strategy and approach in trying to make hydrogen work?
Sure. I think it's important to understand that just like electrons, at least within a planetary atmosphere, electrons and hydrogen do not naturally exist in abundance. They're both energy vectors, right? They're both ways to move energy around, and require immediate use or storage. You know, there's different strengths and weaknesses there. It's really hard to beat hydrocarbons because you can hold them. You know, you can put them in a barrel and it can sit at room temperature and pressure, and it's great, right? But obviously there's a carbon impact there. So I think we just have to acknowledge that we wouldn't be here talking about any of this stuff if it wasn't about the carbon impact of these fuels. So they are technically more challenging in some ways. They do add some cost, and that is the journey that we're all embarking on as a society. So I think we just have to acknowledge that and understand, really, I think, what is the lowest cost pathway to mitigate carbon. So then what does hydrogen have to do with that? Well, if you think about the energy vector aspect of it, you know, you look at if you could have on-demand, instantaneous generation of power that's renewable, then battery vehicles are ubiquitous and great applications, and we can, you know, electrification is something that's kind of a go-do easy thing across the board. But that's not the case, right? Most renewable electrons will be generated intermittently. And so the reality is that we need to find ways to buffer this. Even with a hydrocarbon energy grid as we have, we still have huge over installation of capacity. Why? Because we have peaky loads. So we have peaking plants, we've got baseload plants, we've got capacity markets, we've got grid services. There's all of these different markets. Why? Because the grid is essentially on demand with very little buffer. It's actually a pretty amazing supply chain when you look at it, right? There's no other supply chain in the world or any other material that has no buffer like this. So what does hydrogen have to do with all this? Well, when you start adding in a source that's more and more unreliable, so to speak, right? That is intermittent, which is wind and solar. When someone goes and flicks on their switch or goes to charge their car, that electron isn't necessarily available there. But if it is available, that means that there's a cost associated to make it available. And so what I focus on in hydrogen in the energy transition is there's a technical argument about efficiency, right? Wheel-to-well efficiency of, all right, if I generate an electron at a wind farm and I look at the process to then put that into a wheel and have it roll, you know, battery, pure electrification is certainly from an efficiency standpoint a winner. But what's the cost, right? To have that on-demand electricity, you have to over-install capacity to a point where there's actually probably even the need to maintain gas-fed peakers in there to make sure that happens. So that renewable power, 100% renewable power penetration may not be possible without some sort of buffer. This is where hydrogen can play a role, right? So hydrogen is just an energy vector, to say that again. It is not a primary energy source. It's made from electricity or biomass sources, or even, you know, from gray hydrogen, which is steam methane reformation, as we've heard about already. But where it can offer a lot of value is we see use cases right now with heavy duty, medium duty, moving into rail and marine, and even light duty, where we are in the next 5 to 10 years price parity or even better than conventional fuels. So from a cost, at the end of the day, I focus on not technology, I focus on what is the lowest cost to society to decarbonize, and hydrogen offers a pathway. Why? Because in hydrogen, you can take garbage electrons that no one wants, so low value, and you can upgrade it to one of the highest value energy products out there, which is an on-demand mobility fuel. So that arbitrage in price to cost actually, in many instances, more than overcomes the efficiency loss. So I think we should take our techno hats off and put on our commercial hats and realize there's actually a role for this in the future. Shifting to what Shell's interest in hydrogen. So we have existing power and fuels, catalysts, petrochemicals products business. We have a big retail business, right? So we have existing businesses that are in disruption. We know this. We are committed to shifting our businesses to meet the new energy mix of the near future and the long future global society. And we have a number of strategy papers out there that you can find in public domain. And we see hydrogen as part of that mix. So we have biofuels business, we have hydrogen business, we have a charging business, a powers business. All this comes together to provide solutions that customers want. What we have to be careful of is not pushing solutions onto customers that they don't see a future for. So for example, light duty mobility is a great example of, yes, there's a lot of penetration for batteries in that space. However, there are use cases even within that, where if you're looking at high duty cycles, for example, taxis or fleets that are on the road, a large percentage of the time, when you're charging for that hour or 2 or 3 hours a day that you're charging, you're not making money. And so we see examples of a fast charge, high, easy refueling experience does tend to create a customer experience that people like. So I challenge us to think about things in terms of the customer, in terms of the economics of what we're doing, not just simply from an engineering perspective of efficiency and total energy consumption, because that's how our current energy system works, right? Users are at the center of the current energy systems, and they will be in the future as well. Last thing I'll say is, what are we doing in hydrogen? We do have mobility networks we're building out in California, in Europe, in China. We are building and scaling green hydrogen production. Blue and gray hydrogen production will be a part of this. Why? Because again, from a global perspective, you look at China, gray hydrogen is lower carbon than grid power by a large margin, right? So if we're talking about energy transition, the carbon content of the local energy systems change by region. And so we have to be very diligent about focusing on decarbonizing over time, not just jumping to the end state, because we have a cost, supply, demand, cost, supply chain to build, all these things are playing at once. So we have to make sure that we do that in a managed way, because we've done it with renewables, right? We're not looking for battery cars to be zero emissions. They're charging off the grid. But there's a pathway to zero, and it's the same thing with hydrogen, right? It's great today. We're mixing in green, certainly in California, where I think at least 60% green on our hydrogen that we're fueling into cars, on the way to 100% very closely or very soon. So there's a pathway to get there, and it won't be there today, but we certainly have to start and scale these supply chains, which are shallow, weak. We need support for scaling up orders and products and innovation and all this stuff to actually justify the bigger investments in green hydrogen. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. And I think, since Secretary Simmons mentioned it, I've been trying to think about how I'm going to celebrate Hydrogen Day. And I think electron arbitrage, I'm sure there's a meme there somewhere that we can make out of it for the day next week. So I appreciated that framing. John, let me come back to you. One of the things that I took from your presentation was there's kind of like just a lot of different options of getting there. And they involve, as you rightly pointed out, especially towards the end, very different trade-offs, especially in terms of electricity use. But help us understand a little bit, what is on that list that is sort of 3 years out versus 10 years out? Like, how should we be thinking about how close these ideas are from getting out and being deployed at scale?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think realistically, if you think about the industrial timescale for getting any new technology out, anything that is 3 years out is basically de-risked today. So I think, just like with batteries, the next battery that's going to come and it's going to really move the needle is still at the very early nascent stage of technology. So I think in the near term, there will be, I think, very little disruptions. If we do have opportunities, as Matthew's indicating, where there's areas where we have otherwise curtailed electrons, and we can start converting these to hydrogen or start converting these to other liquid fuels. But those are technologies that we can start seeing, I think, in the near term. The real opportunities are for the sort of breakthrough technologies, and even 10 years is probably a time scale where if that really is going to be the time frame for market impact, they've been discovered by now, because because of the pipeline timeline for that. So I think if we look at what's available within the laboratory space right now and what's being done in research labs and development labs across industry in the country, we have a pretty good idea of what technologies will probably be in the marketplace. It's really looking mid-century when we really have to start moving the needle in an aggressive way and getting the last bits of recalcitrant carbon out of the fueling infrastructure. Those are the areas where the sort of the wild cards are, where really the technology is not yet pointing in any one direction. So we need to start marching down that path, but there could be bifurcations in the landscape that point us in different directions as time evolves.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to wildcards and try to pick your brain on what those wildcards might be. But let me turn to Bruno. Talk to us a little bit about sort of the waste, the feedstock side of this, and the ability to secure the feedstock. What are the challenges in doing so? Whether that is from a regulatory or from a pricing or from a sort of counterparty perspective. Talk to us a little bit about the feedstock challenge of municipal solid waste.
That's a great question, because it's not only relevant for our pathway, municipal solid waste, but for any of the other biofuels. How do you access the feedstock for long enough to build your business plan? In our case, the founders of Fulcrum were in the first generation of biofuels industry, and they realized that access to feedstock in the long term, it's key. So they went out and talked to large waste companies in the US, Waste Management and Waste Connections, and managed to negotiate long-term agreements for exclusive access to waste for 20 years. 20 years is the economic life of a biorefinery. So it covers the needs for the production for that long time, which is what, at the end of the day, the lenders want to see. Now, we were successful in securing the rights to the waste all over the United States, which also speaks to the growth potential, the scale up of these processes. As I mentioned, the MSW is everywhere in large urban areas. That's where you want to build your biorefineries. And that's important from a scale-up perspective, because you want to make an impact. It's great to have one plant or two plants, but it's even better to have a fleet of 8 or 9. Our first plant is being built right now in outside Reno. It's going to be 10 million gallons per year, which is, in the big scheme of things, relatively small. But in our approach with having the feedstock secured and the technology that we're going to be replicating in all of the different plants, we have a program for getting up to 400 million gallons per year by replicating the first plant in numerous sites across the country. And that's possible because we're able to secure the feedstock. Just to put it in perspective, feedstock could be anywhere between 50 to 80% of the cost of the finished fuel. And by this being a waste, we get it at a very low cost, essentially a zero cost. So by doing that, we're able to secure the economics for building and financing the plants. So we need to see the feedstock as a foundational decision in this type of projects when you're getting to market, because the feedstock is not only abundant, but it's also, from the economic perspective, very beneficial. And also let's talk about the sustainability and the environmental perspectives. By using a waste, we're not competing with any type of crops or any alternative uses for the waste. We actually take, this is all post-recycled waste. In Reno, we take a lot of the waste from Northern California and from Nevada. These have gone through all of the recycling that you could do to it. And so by the time it gets to us, the alternative is to put it on the ground. So we're giving it a second turn to all this organic and carbon and hydrogen that is embedded in the waste. We're doing that in a way that allows us to build, as I said, fleet of plants that will eventually reach 400 million gallons per year in the United States.
Let me ask you actually one follow-up. This is just me not knowing enough about the topic, so maybe some people in the audience don't as well. So how should we think about the cost of feedstock? And by that, I mean its variation. I mean, what you describe is is this a constant stream? Is it a stream that changes depending on location? Is it, is it more expensive in California than it is somewhere else? Or are you, at the end of the day, looking at a relatively straightforward, typical feedstock, no matter where you are? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that's the essence of these long-term agreements that we managed to do with these large waste companies. And that's important too, because waste can be handled, or you see many cases where it's handled by local governments, municipalities, cities, and so forth. And there it's very difficult. You need to get enough waste, you may have to negotiate with 2, 3, 4, maybe 10 counterparties, and that's difficult to replicate. By going with the large waste handlers, we're able to get, in essence, a blanket agreement across the United States that guarantees the same terms and conditions all over the country, which I think is your question. So our economics are going to look very similar in all of our projects. And also the 20 years is important because that also removes a big source of uncertainty that you see in commodity markets. Use cooking oil. It's very popular for biofuel production, but you're subject to the shocks in the commodity markets. It's difficult to make long-term agreements. Maybe you have a couple of years, and so it's very difficult to achieve financing when your time horizon is so short.
Thank you, Bruno. Matthew, let me come back to you. You mentioned in your first round sort of 5 to 10 year horizon about sort of price parity or competitiveness. Just help us understand a little bit the economics and what's driving this. I mean, is this really purely a matter of sort of scale and building out infrastructure? Are there other things that we should be thinking about in when you get that sort of crossover point where it's either the same or more economic to use hydrogen? Help us understand some of the economics here.
Sure. I think what I focus on at Shell is I have global responsibility for supply chain, product, and engineering development, which is really important right now in this phase that we find ourselves in hydrogen. Why? Because there's been, I think it was mentioned earlier, there has been hype cycles in the past, right? And these hype cycles have flopped because there's some key elements missing, right? Policy and public support on a mass scale and on a society scale is needed, right? We start to see that around the globe. The technology needs to be ready. We see that now, and so forth. Now, the one remaining piece is that the supply chain is kind of one of the last things to come into play because no one's going to make investments, long-term investments, and take technologies into products, right? Products are technology that makes money, and unless there's a business case to do it. So the thing I focus primarily on is how do we take thin, weak supply chains and deepen them and make them robust so that we can scale, right? We want to turn these supply chains into something that can bear the weight of billions of dollars in investment, and they're not there yet. So when we look at cost and these types of things, it's really we shouldn't be expecting widespread infrastructure levels of cost reduction, whatnot, without more market penetration. So certainly it's a chicken or egg problem, perhaps, but we really do have to solve these problems at the same time. Now, what I will say about the energy future, right, is that one of the problems that the reason why we're talking about this decarbonization issue is because we almost exclusively use hydrocarbons as our energy source, no matter what application it is. So in the future, I think we need to be looking at a robust, diverse energy system to prevent the unintended consequences we can't figure out yet, right? So part of that is, electrification of batteries are relatively easy to start because you have a grid, but they're hard to scale because you have a grid. Grid upgrades, as we know, are incredibly contentious issues, right-of-way issues, not in my backyard issues, these types of things. So, and they will be overcome because we just have to, but they present certain challenges. Hydrogen is hard to start, because there is no hydrogen grid. There's no wall plug that you can plug your car in and get hydrogen out of it. However, if you get over that initial hump, which is actually not that we're not talking about single digits of market penetration. We're talking about fractions of a percent, be it mobility, or even say 1% of the gas grid if it contains hydrogen, or less. That's even enough to activate this market. Then it scales very easily because it scales like a hydrocarbon at that point. If you look at all the supply chains we have in place for moving liquid fuels around, for moving gaseous fuels around by pipeline, that's how you move hydrogen. Right? If you look at the natural gas infrastructure today, that's how hydrogen infrastructure will look like 20 years from now. So we convert our pipelines, convert our leverage the refineries, leverage all of the infrastructure that's in place to scale hydrogen, and it'll happen very quickly. So what we're very focused on is activating these markets to get over that initial S curve that we're on.
Thank you. You talked about the grid, and about half the questions that I'm seeing are about the grid and electricity and how we're going to build out all this supply. So I might come back to that in a sec, but I did want to do a follow-up because you mentioned the sort of the gas grid conversion, and that's most of my background is in natural gas, so it's something I focus on a lot. And so I was wondering if you could just do a couple more seconds on this, and how should we be thinking about the repurposing of the gas grid, sort of blending, to what extent does the gas grid sort of enable hydrogen? How should we be thinking about that overlap?
Yeah, and this actually gets to, there's many ways to roam here that different regions around the world think about what's the thin entering wedge for hydrogen. Some regions think about it as mobility is the first way to do it, but other regions are thinking about the gas grid as the first way to do it. It's counterintuitive because the natural gas for heating and industrial processes have it's the lowest cost point for energy of any energy source, right? It's especially in the US. Now that's not necessarily true in Europe and other places, but nonetheless, it's still very cheap. So why would you enter the market where the cost point or the price point is extremely low with a very high price fuel or high price replacement? Well, the reason is that blending into the natural gas grid at say 1 to 2% offers a massive market for hydrogen compared to where we are today, yet requires very little, if any, changes to the grid itself. So when we think about ethanol, right, there's a 10%, some places have 10% or even more ethanol requirement with no change to your car. This is the same kind of thing, although it's scalable, right? Where if you get into that activation period, right? So to activate this market, we're not talking about replacing whole pipelines or doing double-digit, blending or whatnot. We're saying if you could, mandate or require, say, fractions of a percent or even percent of blending of hydrogen into the grid, you can unlock all these other use cases as well. Like mobility all of a sudden becomes cost parity because of how the volume of hydrogen you're making at that point and the distribution systems you put in place. So there's a different way of thinking about it. You can go build the mobility infrastructure to then generate cars and demand and generate demand that way, or you could generate enough demand by blending in pipelines and then back into mobility, right? You can take a different approach depending on local strengths and weaknesses.
Thank you, Matthew. John, let me come back to you. We left you on the wild cards, and so I want to come back to that idea and maybe get your sense of kind of like what are those that could reshape how we think about this sort of as we go further out in the horizon towards mid-century.
Sure. So I think there's a couple different venues that these wildcards could emerge into. So one that we haven't really talked about much is the advanced engine landscape. We're looking at today's engine technologies, and they've come a long way. There are engine approaches that allow us to get higher efficiency. Some of the benefits are not quite as noticeable. We start talking about your large marine engines, and again, if we're focusing on those types of very large engines as the hardest to decarbonize part of the system, there could be some approaches there that could be important if they are a bit more omnivorous, if you will, in terms of the fuels that they can accept. And right now, the challenge is making a fuel that looks like today's diesel or distillate fuel, whether it's for aircraft or for marine applications. So this is challenging from the standpoint of e-fuels because it requires a lot of electrons to make a fuel that looks like today's fuels. So one of the Wildcards could be that you take advantage of the tremendous flexibility and ingenuity that nature has, find a way to take a biological process, marry it with an electrochemical process, and reduce the number of electrons required to produce a fuel, taking advantage of biology's unique talents in making things that look very tailored to a specific application. So there's work going on right now that's looking at that. It will not be something that hits the market in 10 years or so, but it could be a way that we get over some of these energy and sort of greenhouse gas challenges by just getting a more efficient process, tapping into the talents that nature has. Of course, we know from the benefits or from the experience with biofuels, the challenge is getting scale. Biological processes do things very efficiently, but they are hard to scale to the same type of industrial levels that we need to address the global challenges. Assistant Secretary Simmons mentioned the challenge of scale. So the wild card is that we find something that not just works well in the laboratory, but scales well to the industrial level.
Thank you. We actually have a few questions that are coming in different forms, so I'm going to try to group a few of them together. But and this is for you, John, to continue on this. There's been some questions about sort of CNG. I don't think it sort of came up at all in your discussion, so maybe, but more generally, sort of renewable gas, one idea, biodiesel, I think you mentioned, but just give us a sense of kind of where we are on your matrix of sort of whether it is, weight and application or something else, kind of like where should we be thinking about those technologies?
Yeah, great question. And renewable natural gas, if we're thinking about the current approaches for capturing from landfills and other microbial processes, it's a great option. And it's one that we should definitely maximize and continue to improve upon because it provides a fuel that we already know how to utilize. We have engines that can operate efficiently with it. We have emissions technologies that allow us to burn it cleanly. So to the extent that we can take that mature technology and, extract all the benefits possible, then that's great. Biodiesel, again, a great fuel. It's a good drop-in. It is something that has worked well, very mature at this point. Renewable diesel is another one. There are some resource issues, so maybe some of the technologies that Bruno's talking about can be used to help expand the options in terms of how we produce fuels that look like today's fuels. So I didn't spend a lot of time on them because they're fairly mature, but we definitely need to make sure that in our arsenal of approaches, we maximize the benefit from the current fuels that allow us to achieve benefits in terms of emissions reduction.
Matthew, let me come to you. There's a question from the audience that talks about sort of safety and consumer sort of perception, whether that is sort of a NIMBY or putting hydrogen and co-locating at gas stations. So can you just talk a little bit about, what are you seeing are the consumer perceptions, the willingness to, interact with this kind of infrastructure, safety concerns, things like that from your perspective?
Sure, and it's a valid question, right? Because I think the question stems from it's the unknown, right? There's not a lot known about hydrogen. We think about, of course, the Hindenburg, right, back in early days. But it's like apples and oranges, really. And what I think a lot about risk normalization, right? So what I think about is gasoline and diesel and how dangerous that is, right? And we've normalized those risks because it's everywhere. And there's vapors, they can ignite, there's static electricity discharges, and it's dangerous, but we've learned how to work with it, right? There's standards in place. There are societal norms on how to work with it. So the advantage we have with hydrogen is decades, decades and decades of safety research and development and very, very good international standards. So what's nice about the work that's been done is that if you go to a refueling site in China or Netherlands or Vancouver, they have generally the same standards for the equipment. And what those standards do is the refueling process, the transfer process, how we move things around, it's all computer controlled and automated. So whereas you go up to, say, a liquid pump, you've got a gas nozzle. If you've ever thought about it, you could just spray gas everywhere, right? I know you wouldn't do it, but you could do it, right? You just can't do that with hydrogen. It's not possible because of the the refueling process is all automated and controlled for this reason, right? There's multiple safety barriers, multiple physical software and behavioral controls in place to prevent that. Looking at, say, tanks, right? So if the certification for tanks and how to, onboard the vehicles, for example, right now you've got these high pressure hydrogen tanks. I just went through this certification on a tank for a large truck, actually. We have to go through 20 different tests, which involves firing a 30 caliber round at it, burning it in a bonfire for 20 minutes, overpressurizing it to 3.5 times its working pressure, cycling it for 60,000 times, right? We absolutely beat these things up, and they have to pass, right? And I use that across, nozzles, compressors, how we make this stuff as well. It's high technology, right? And I guess this gets back to my opening comment that this is tougher, this is harder to do. Why? Because we have the technology to make it safer. We have the ability to push the bounds, and that's exactly what we're doing. So when we educate people on what this looks like, and with the local fire marshals and the local communities where we're building it, actually people get quite excited because the safety of this is actually better, I would say, than some of the other fuel products out there, just simply because of the technology and the automation brought to across the supply chain.
Thank you, Matthew. Bruno, let me ask you a similar question, but going again to the question of sort of the customer adoption, not necessarily on safety, but more broadly, like when you try to sort of market this product, what is the customer what is the customer asking of you, and what are the sort of challenges that they are grappling with before they sort of commit to offtake?
That's a great question to focus on what the customer wants, right, for this kind of products. Well, first of all, they want something that meets their existing requirements for the equipment they have. We have been focusing on the aviation industry. That's been a two-way street, actually. Like was mentioned before, especially by John, it's a very hard to decarbonize sector. So airplanes are going to be flying on liquid fuels for many years to come. And so the airlines actually approached us and other companies like us about solutions, because for the traveling public, the carbon emissions are very important. But it's also very important for the traveling passenger to know that the fuel is going to work. So the aviation industry as a whole has spent a lot of time and effort and resources certifying that these fuels work, that they are drop-in, which is very important because they don't want to adjust any of their equipment. There is a vast supply chain out there, and these fuels need to meet those requirements so it can just flow without any changes. And we've done that as an industry as a whole. And the low carbon aspect is it was very important 10 years ago, and it's increasingly important today. It's vital now for the strategy of, especially for airlines, to decarbonize, and liquid transportation fuels is key for that. And it's been very interesting to see that the aviation industry's specific companies have stepped up, not only with willing to buy the product once we have it, but also to invest. In our case, we've received direct investment in Fulcrum from large airlines. United Airlines, for example, invested $30 million a number of years ago. We have Cathay Pacific, Japan Airlines, Air BP is another investor, and a few other companies, because they see that in order to move the needle for low carbon fuels to reach aviation, it's important to have that incentive, not only from buying the product, but also to helping to get these plants built by investing and getting a little bit up in the supply chain.
Let me ask you a follow-up, because you mentioned sort of the centrality of this being a sort of a drop-in option. So help us understand the difference between sort of the blending sort of approach versus this being a standalone, kind of like 100% of the energy needed on the plane sort of coming from your product. How should we think about sort of the deep decarbonization challenge versus the sort of blending, making a dent on the curve today challenge?
Yes, it's a great question. I think it's a matter of time right? In the United States, the aviation fuel market, it's about 20 billion gallons a year. Well, maybe it was last year, maybe it's going to be less this year, but it's quite up there. And as I said, once we're fully developed in the US, we're going to be producing about 400 millions. So orders of magnitude less of what the industry needs. So that's a big challenge for us, a big opportunity. And so that 50% blending limitation that exists today, unfortunately, we're not going to be hitting it anytime soon. Now, I do want to maybe talk a little bit about how that 50% was established. For obvious reasons, the aviation industry is very cautious, very conservative. The ASTM process for certifying new fuels is very rigorous. And frankly, so the 50% was established to as an abundance of caution, which we all accept. I mean, we want these fuels to be absolutely safe and have there to be no concerns. But as the industry gains experience with these fuels, right, once we reach 1 or 2% on a daily basis, and then it's going to be 5%, 10%, 15%, that's all going to be experience that we can then take back to ASTM and then look for, can we increase the blending limit? Can we go from 50 to 60 to 70 to 80? And in addition to that, that's for existing technologies. There are other pathways that have been proven at 100%. So today there are at least 2 pathways that you could use 100% as a drop-in fuel. And so there are ways to get there. But, I really wish that would be a problem that we hit at, where we are, we have so much product that we're hitting 50% of what the blending limitation is right now.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. Sometimes we do tend to try to solve the problem that will emerge in 20 years from now, and it's good to think about it, but we should also make progress to get to that point where that's the next problem to solve. John, let me come to you. There was a question from the audience about ammonia, and so maybe I wanted to ask you about marine shipping more broadly and sort of what you see the solution set there and the challenges in sort of how to make any one of those solutions work.
Ammonia for marine applications is, in many ways, it's a great fit because it's a carbon-free fuel. It's condensable, so you can get a high energy density with it. And ammonia combustion has been the subject of discussion for a long time. The question is, can we get low carbon pathways to produce this? And so some of the same challenges we're talking about in terms of making sure that your electricity is sourced from low carbon sources is important. There's always the opportunity to improve the conversion pathways. We have existing pathways that we can utilize in the near term, but seeing a longer term pathway towards that. It is a really good match in many respects.
Thank you for that. Matthew, I wanted to maybe actually ask you a similar question, just in terms of the marine shipping, just kind of maybe talk a little bit about hydrogen in application in marine shipping.
Sure. So there's the use of the fuel on board itself as the shipping as a fuel for marine, but then there's also energy arbitrage and international shipping, right? If you look at Europe, some of these energy centers like China and Japan, South Korea, they can't make all of the clean energy they need to decarbonize. So there will be an energy import, just like there is today, right? These locations, with the exception of Europe, have LNG cargo imports, right? Most of the gas and the molecules that are consumed in those countries are imported via LNG and in some cases subsea pipeline today. So I made the earlier comment that if we fast forward 50 years, why would hydrogen infrastructure or some of these other infrastructures look substantially different than that? And I don't think they will. I think they'll just, you could see cargoes of ammonia being transported or cargoes of LH2 being transported. There's a project that we're a part of right now called the Hydra project. There's an LH2 ship right now that is moving cargoes of LH2 between Southeast Asian countries to just explore this, right? It's something that needs development. But certainly we need to be understanding how do we So this is costly, right? It's new technology. It's liquefaction is horribly expensive, and especially when we're talking about LH2, which is much colder than LNG. So that offers different challenges, but we have to solve that problem. We have to solve the problem of figuring out how to move energy from high renewable resource centers like the Middle East, Northern Africa, Chile, these places to load centers. So I think right now it's not quite clear. It might be a mix of, say, ammonia, LH2, and again, there might be other technologies like metal hydrides, but I think it's likely going to be one of those two or a combination of those two to move energy on a global level.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes to go, so I have a few more questions that I'll try to get in. Bruno, let me come to you, and I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the economics of this relative to jet fuel. You talked about not being sort of susceptible to the ups and downs of the cycle, so that's a sort of volatility is an important thing. But helping us understand just sort of at what point does this become sort of cost competitive, or to what extent is this driven by the customer or a regulatory desire for blending and for reducing the carbon intensity, and this being sort of a premium product versus sort of cost competitive today. So give us a sense of the economics of this.
Yeah, great question. And I guess I think you've noticed a theme is going back to the feedstock. When 50 to 80% of your cost is the feedstock, you want to go for something that is a very, very low cost, which we've done. So our cost basis for the feedstock is essentially zero. So it gives us a big advantage to get the price of the fuel very, very close to what the price of conventional fuel is. Now, on the regulatory side, that's key because even though we can produce the fuel at a very low cost, we also need to finance the plants. And when you go to look for financing, the investors are looking at multiple opportunities, not only fuels, but big data, any kind of other business sectors. So you need to show the returns. And in this case, the regulatory framework is a double-edged sword. Let's compare California to the federal system. The California LCFS has been a foundational rock for this industry. California, the LCFS program has been very, very clear from the beginning, has very clear goals. The low carbon credits are priced at a very high value. So there is increasingly a lot of interest in selling fuel in California, and investors like that. They see that as a very stable market they want to be in. On the other hand, we have the RFS, the federal system, where it's a complicated system. There's no question about it, and how we got there, it's going to be another 10 days to explain. But needless to say, investors are concerned. Things, policy related can change the curve on the RIN prices from one week to the next. And that uncertainty is certainly not helpful. So the policy environment is very important. And to the extent that we can get the same, long-term certainty as to what is going to happen to incentives. Another good example is the biodiesel tax credit. Used to be a year-to-year tax credit that would be given to biodiesel producers. But sometimes it would not be extended, or it would be extended retroactively. So these companies really were struggling to really understand, where I'm going to be profit-wise in the next few months. Now we got a 5-year extension for that tax credit, so that provides a little bit more certainty. And I think that underscores the importance for the biofuels to look for low-cost feedstock, so you can reduce your cost of production and be able to take the upside of regulation, but also don't be hurt when the volatility hits.
Thank you, Bruno. We have about a minute left, but I did have one question that's also come in that I wanted to ask Matthew to close us up. You mentioned sort of, we have to think about hydrogen, gray versus green versus blue from a location specific, but I wanted if you could just expand a little bit more on that, how should we be thinking about these different ways of producing hydrogen from both a cost, but also from a carbon perspective?
Sure. So today, because the system we've set up is a carbon intense system, it's no surprise that gray hydrogen is the cheapest hydrogen to generate. Why? The input feedstocks drive the cost. So right now, green electricity is more expensive in certain regions. It's cheap in remote locations, but then the problem is that moving that product from that remote location to the load center is expensive, so that limits you there. But that's not true necessarily over time, right? We've seen that with renewables on the grid. So what I think the way to think about this is about a roadmap. So the roadmap is we have sequestration, we've got conventional production of hydrogen methodologies today, gray, we have green. Those are all technically feasible. We know how to do them, but it's about launching an industry. It's about kind of feathering the clutch on the way to a low or zero emission future. And so the way I think about it is that hydrogen infrastructure and vehicles and use cases they'll have, depending on what the local policy requires, right, may have a starting point of carbon intensity. So you can dial it in California, we can dial it in to say, we're better than a battery. We'll just always be better than a battery vehicle, right? We'll dial it in to say, we'll have a green content and a gray content mix that we're at least better than the grid equivalent, for example. And then the infrastructure that's set up in the vehicles, there's no difference between green and gray and blue hydrogen. It's just hydrogen, right? And so as that supply chain launches and lights up and that cost for green hydrogen comes down, which follows the same kind of dynamics I've already talked about, that needle goes up, nothing changes downstream from the production side.
Well, Matthew, thank you. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, John. This has been a fantastic conversation. I learned a ton. And given the questions that are coming in, I think our audience was very interested in what you had to say as well. So I want to thank you for joining me in this conversation. Thank you to our audience for listening in and for sending in our questions. And please be on the lookout for the final wrap-up event of this series. You'll get a notification out from our website at some point. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.